Good morning and
Morning.
welcome back to another episode of the DD Geopolitics live stream. I'm your host and I am here with John again, exhausted as always. And finally, after so long and so much persistence, Sharmine Narwani, a seasoned journalist and political analyst specializing in the Middle East, writing exclusively on regional or extensively on the region's conflicts and power dynamics, focusing on Western intervention, and regular contributor to the Cradle. Hi, Sharmine. It is so nice to finally have you on the show.
I'm really happy to finally be here, Sarah. Thank you for having me.
Good morning, John. How are you?
Doing great. And yeah, we are big fans of the Cradle and very excited to do this interview and just really elevate the voice of West Asian politics. So I'm excited to get into it.
We'd like to hear that.
So we'll get right into it with obviously the Middle East and the Levant, where tensions are escalating and developments are unfolding pretty rapidly. We recently witnessed the targeted assassinations by Israel, which many anticipated would trigger immediate retaliation from Iran. However, that response has yet to come. We're all still anticipating. Meanwhile, ceasefire talks have came and collapsed, and conflicting narratives on either side about what actually happened. Why do you think these ceasefire talks failed, and why did they fall through, and what are the key factors contributing to the difference of perspectives?
I mean, the ceasefire talks are not going anywhere, largely because of the Netanyahu government and their insistence on shifting the goalposts at every new round of talks. And this has been going on for a long time. Just in a nutshell, earlier this summer, Joe Biden's administration announced a ceasefire proposal that he claimed the Israelis had agreed to already. And within no time, the Israelis responded by saying, no, we don't know about this. We haven't signed on to anything. And, you know, in Israel, there's conflicting views on this, obviously. And as the war hardens and worsens, those conflicting views become more pronounced, which we can get into briefly. But I mean, the latest update is, you know, we had an unsuccessful round of talks in Doha in the last few days, which were sponsored by the Americans, the Qataris, and the Egyptians. And that ball has been kicked down the road further. We heard that on Wednesday this week, talks would pick up again in Cairo. That hasn't happened. Now we're being told the talks will convene on Saturday or Sunday this weekend. But today, Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, another Palestinian resistance group, prominent one in Gaza, released a joint statement saying that the resistance will reject any agreement that does not include an Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. Now, I mean, we're at such basic and major points of difference in these talks, because the Palestinians, of course, want a permanent ceasefire in Gaza, which is the refrain of most international institutions and even allied states of Israel. Now the Israelis every few days come out and make a statement, and Netanyahu has done this several times in the last weeks, saying that he has confirmation from the Americans that they will support an Israeli relaunch of the war once they've received their hostages. There's no permanent ceasefire really being discussed. I mean, the Israelis are not interested, or at least the Netanyahu government is not interested in permanent ceasefire. And we know this from their comments. Now, when the Palestinian resistance made these statements today, they're basically not only saying like there has to be a permanent ceasefire, guys, for this to be, for there to be any agreement, but Israeli forces must withdraw from the Gaza Strip. The Israelis do not want to do that. They have already, in the last round of talks, introduced some new notions, which is that Israeli troops will maintain a presence on the Rafah border with Egypt, permanently or for the foreseeable future. And they will also maintain a presence on the Netzarim corridor, which is a man-made corridor created by the Israeli military during the Gaza war, that essentially severs North and South Gaza from each other. A further complication is that the Israelis are not only insisting on staying on the Netzarim border, but they want to be able to search every single Palestinian who intends to return to their homes in the north. One of the things we at the Cradle understood quite early on in this conflict is that Israel wants to empty out northern Gaza, create a buffer inside this very, very small sliver of land that 2.4 million Palestinians live on. And so they want to determine who can go up there. And it might be part of something that was discussed a few months earlier about creating an alternative Palestinian government in Gaza to find basically collaborators, Palestinians who would collaborate with the Israeli regime in Gaza. And those folks might be allowed to then take over northern Gaza and administer northern Gaza as an alternative government. So, I mean, it's all very nefarious. You can't have a ceasefire without a complete cessation of violence, hostilities, military fire. And you can't end the conflict if Israeli troops still remain in the territory, which is, as I mentioned, a very, very small space where, at least half of the Palestinians there now find themselves completely homeless and huddled in tent camps, et cetera. So, basically Israel's not giving an inch. And I have to say, like, that and a bunch of airstrikes in Lebanon the last few days, further into Lebanese depth, and Israel's just general belligerence and its tone, including these strikes, have suddenly, I found people in Lebanon, like important security types in Lebanon, who have for 10 months said, no, this is not going to end up in a war, are recalibrating their positions. They now believe that we're going to get in a war. Now, at the Cradle, many of us, and it wasn't like an absolute, like, we weren't all in agreement, but from early on, many of us thought that unless Israel stops within 30 days of its brutal assault on Gaza, we would find ourselves in a war of attrition in which Israel would start to hemorrhage many things that it holds dear and crucial for its survival. And at that point, Israel would only be able to escalate itself out of the war. When I say out of the war, meaning thinking that they could reach a victory somehow. And bizarrely unable to conquer Gaza, in which 21 of the 24 Hamas battalions still exist today after 10 months of the war. Israel is now trying to turn its attention to its northern border, where the much stronger axis of resistance group, the Lebanese resistance, Hezbollah, is, with all kinds of missile capabilities and firepower that we've not seen in a conflict between these two countries in the past. So, no, Israel is not interested in ceasefire. It's that simple. And of course, the narrative in the West is always try to blame Hamas. Hamas didn't come to the talks in Gaza because they said it's pointless. We have people there who can speak for us and convey messages to us, but we understand going in the big sort of brouhaha, like, oh, this is going to be we're going to reach an agreement. They understood early on that wasn't the case. Israel just kept adding more and more provisions to the negotiations that were untenable. And now we see an escalation on the ground, by Israel. And so, we don't foresee a ceasefire happening, and possibly a war with even breaking out.
Well, I wanted to ask you about the strategy of Western governments, because there's this talk about a ceasefire that persists. We just had the Democratic Convention this week, and you've heard politicians get up on the convention floor and talk about, we need to have a ceasefire and bring the hostages home, right? There's always the emphasis on the hostages, of course, and then for those of us who've been following the conflict know that any nature of a ceasefire will be temporary just by the very nature. the core grievances of the resistance not being addressed and the occupation continuing, that at least in some form, this aggression and occupation is going to persist. And the war on Gaza certainly will persist in some capacity. So I'm curious to kind of get your thoughts about what the strategy of the West is here, given that, of course, the United States is not really interested in engaging on any of the core grievances of the resistance. Is this really just kind of a way for the United States to cover up to any degree that they can the brutality of this war, of what's happening in Gaza right now, and continue to kind of present to the international community that they're interested in a ceasefire, although we all know well that the prospects for such a ceasefire are just not likely or not possible?
The term Western strategy is so oxymoronic to me. Here's the problem. I mean, just the way the electoral process works in many of these Western countries, the fact that you have these turnovers from, it's usually two parties, right? This party or that party, and they switch over and nothing fundamentally changes. The West is plagued by short-termism in governance. And so we're only ever looking at tactics as opposed to strategy, which is a more holistic approach to a problem, right? I always say, like, these systems have essentially collapsed, certainly in the United States and I think Great Britain, but they have for decades actually just tried to put tape or band-aids on serious problems and not address the problems at their core. So yeah, there's no real Western strategy right now. I think the focus for certainly the outgoing administration of Joe Biden is to maintain a Democrat come November, and to get through these elections without its closest ally upending everything for them, so they understand very clearly. The Cradle had a piece on this yesterday on, Harris versus Trump, who's better for Gaza.
God.
And we all have opinions on this, actually. I mean, none of them, because they're basically they toe the Israeli line on all things. But at some point, Israel becomes a liability for any American administration. I mean, there are people who think that, oh, no, the US will always do what Israel wants. And that's just not true. I understand why it looks like that's not the case, because they tend to do what the US wants. Just today, we saw a statement, and I can't remember who it was by, but it was basically that the Biden administration had greenlit the $20 billion in additional weapons to Israel, hoping that would convince Netanyahu to strike a ceasefire deal. You don't do that until after you get something. I mean, seriously, like, in that sense, Trump might be a better president, a better negotiator. You just don't do that, So I think right now the Democrats are kicking the can down the road. They know that there is a subsection of their constituents and their electorate, conventional Democrats, who are up in arms about the Gaza issue, and that voice has become louder all the time during these 10 months, and that a lot of the Democratic youth have been swayed heavily by what they're seeing, the genocide in Gaza. So, and these young people are talking about how they're going to vote or how they're not going to vote. It is concerning for them because they need states like Ohio and Wisconsin, et cetera. This looks so far to be a close election where every vote counts. And so you have this, they brought out Kamala Harris, the woman, to sort of, speak more maybe sympathetically to Palestinians. Where she has not, do not forget, she has made zero commitment to an actual policy position that would be different from Joe Biden's. Now, when Trump comes in, like, there's not a lot we know about how he will act in this situation, because the Americans have not faced a situation like this for a very, very long time. But what we do know from his first administration was that he doesn't particularly care for war. He doesn't want to spend his money on that. You know, he like chest thumps about his generals so that he sounds tough, right? And he's good with the military. He's like, let's give them more money, et cetera. But he was the first U.S. president not to initiate a new war in a new territory in a bunch of consecutive U.S. administrations. Number one. Number two, he even took to task U.S. allies for not spending money on the wars they were supposedly allied in, right? So he's a businessman. He doesn't want to spend money if he doesn't have to. And it was a great negotiating tactic because NATO nations, by and large, stepped up to fulfill their financial commitments, probably thanks to Donald Trump. But is Donald Trump going to give away billions of dollars endlessly? He has already called on Israel several times to end this. This is really bad for your PR. You mean, forget genocide, forget all these other things. It's really bad for your PR. He gets it. He gets it as a businessman, okay, and really not a politician, right? He's not a politician. So he might bring some natural sense to this in lockstep establishment thinking that Washington suffers from. And that will be a positive change. Kamala Harris doesn't, she has the Democratic establishment behind her, right? This is very clear, but it's never been clear to me that she's a powerful enough figure to call on important members of the establishment and say, you're going to do it this way. Do you know what I mean? She's the person they want to put up front in the way they did a Joe Biden, obviously with early signs of dementia before he became, president. But they're running the show behind the scenes. Kamala Harris it doesn't occur to me that she has someone to call on and she can pick up the phone and say, we're going to do things differently. She can honestly barely string a sentence together. I cringe when I watch her. And she doesn't seem to have any deep thinking on anything. She's missed soundbite, So I personally, if you want a shift, it would not be Kamala Harris, in my view, right? They're just trying to sweet talk young voters now into giving them their votes. But Trump going to be any better? I mean, he just loves Israel, but he also likes things to go his way. He's got a huge ego. He will fight back. Those are, in my view, more positive traits.
Yeah, Kamala Harris is the type of candidate, right? When in describing the Ukraine conflict, for example, she was like,
big country, little country.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, a big country invaded a little country, and that's bad. And that's basically the extent of her foreign
Russia
policy.
is a bigger country. Ukraine is a smaller country.
Yeah. No, I don't. I cringe. I can't. Do you remember? I mean, in the last election, she was going to be the candidate. You could see that she had a lot of favor and she had a lot of momentum, and then Tulsi Gabbard sunk her in that one debate so beautifully, and she never came back from that. And then, I could see why they would make her vice presidential candidate, because maybe Joe Biden wouldn't last, and then they could put this person with no brain and no voice up there and run the show from behind. That's actually a scary concept. Somebody should sue the Democratic Party for putting Joe Biden up, because they knew, in Discovery, we could discover doctors' reports and stuff that showed that there was a problem.
There's no way they didn't know. They knew. They knew.
Of course. I mean, we could see the diminishment of cognition there. Of course, none of the media talked about it until that one report came out, just a few months back, and then the debate. And to be honest, I didn't think his debate with Trump, I mean, he obviously seemed weaker, but the way they made it out to be like, oh my God, that's it, Biden's over. I didn't get that impression. He'd been talking like that for some time. I mean, he answered Trump back fine. given his.
Yeah,
Which-
I think it was mostly the collapse of the media narrative, right, that they painted for months, saying that, oh, he's not in mental decline, he's not in mental decline. And then the
Well,
debate happens, and they're like, you want to, and we're all asking, wait, now you're going to switch up the candidate? And like the
yeah.
mainstream media in unison is like, are you crazy? He's in mental decline. Of course we have to.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
What does you guys think from an outsider from outside of the United States looking in? I mean, both sides, the people, the population on both sides, one supports is against Israel for their own reasons, and then on the Democrat side, they're more of the pro-Palestine camp, whereas the conservative side is more of a non-interventionist. We just don't want to give them any of our money. Let them figure it out. How does the Middle Eastern, particularly MENA, how do they feel looking at it? Did they have a preference? I mean, I almost feel like looking at it, I would be like, I'd rather have Trump because I feel like he'd be more hands off. But because you get that whole like liberal woke element with Kamala, but I'm not sure if they actually have a preference either way out from the outside perspective.
I mean, I think you can break the region up into different segments as well. I mean, the Persian Gulf was very happy with Trump, because he just couldn't stop banging on about the Iran threat. And then he reversed the deal, right? The nuclear deal. And then he launched, or Jared, what's his name?
Jared
Jared
Kushner,
Kushner.
plan. The peace
launched, the Abraham Accords. But I think in the interim, we've seen so many shifts. So they know they would get what they want from Trump in many ways because they have money. Trump likes money. It's a very cozy relationship. It's not that different with the Democrats, but either. But Trump bangs on about Iran, right? And he did that, gave the Golan Heights to Israel, gave Jerusalem to Israel, as though he can, as though it makes any difference in international law. But so I think, in the Persian Gulf, Arab states, you will have some favor for Trump. The Democrats do annoying things for them. They bring up human rights and authoritarianism, etc. Also, but a lot has changed. And I say that, you guys are close Ukraine watchers. And as you saw after the Ukraine war, the Americans put a lot of screws in, and Europeans, to try to get people to not buy Russian oil and gas, and pushing OPEC to raise production levels so oil prices would plummet and therefore deprive the Russian economy of money to wage war. And actually the Saudis and Emiratis, who are members with Russia in OPEC Plus, refused to do so. They saw it as an opportunity. I mean, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, saw it as an opportunity to make a lot of money in a short time. I don't know if you guys know, but a few years ago, he wanted to take Aramco public and make like $1 trillion off of that public offering. And then boost his Vision 2030 plan, which is like concerts and like sports tournaments and things that Saudi Arabia has not done, and just really revitalize and diversify the Saudi economy. So of course, Mohammed bin Salman was not going to play along with this. He wanted the higher oil prices. And so these shifts it worked out for them. Biden, who said he'd never meet with Mohammed bin Salman, after that, came crawling back and famously fist bumped him, So literally, I would say the Persian Gulf would probably favor a Trump administration more. And then the rest of the region, I mean, probably not favor a Trump administration. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm not talking about North Africa. I'm talking about in West Asia. So from the Levant to the Persian Gulf,
yeah. Well, regardless, we may not even make it to the election. There's actually a third of the United States Navy is out in the Persian Gulf or somewhere in Fifth Fleet, if I remember correctly. That's Fifth Fleet. Do you think that right now Israel is comfortable with the prospect of a regional war, provided that the United States is involved? There's 40,000 sailors. I don't even know what kind of ground, like Army, Marines, or anything like that, but 40,000 U.S. Navy sailors are deployed to that area. Do you think Israel is seeing that as a safeguard, or a potential for escalation, or a potential for, dare I say, a false flag?
Yeah, all of those things. Israel cannot win this war by itself. But the Americans have not won any wars in a very long time. So just to point that out, I don't know why Israel thinks having the Americans involved will help provide a victory for them, because, with the advent of sophisticated targeted missiles, okay, the U.S. conventional military becomes a sitting duck. Okay, so a state with a missile program can very easily target U.S. aircraft carriers, U.S. military bases, U.S. training centers, U.S. Surveillance assets, U.S. troops. And that may in fact come, the Americans may be absolute targets if the U.S. military openly participates with Israel in a war against the resistance axis. So if I were the Americans in this scenario, I would just aid the Israelis in terms of shooting down incoming projectiles and providing them with state-of-the-art intelligence. Anything more than that, and the Pentagon knows, its assets become potential targets, okay? Understandably as well. Many of the countries in this region would like to see a withdrawal of U.S. troops. I mean, certainly in Iraq, they've been trying to negotiate with the Americans for a long time. Americans just won't leave. In Syria, where there are 24 American U.S. bases and facilities in the northeast of Syria, illegally there, siphoning off the country's resources, mainly oil. So this is an opportunity for the resistance axis to make life very uncomfortable for the Americans. So the Israelis need the Americans to, they're not going to win the war. There's no way, no how. And we can discuss why that is if you want. But they need backup. They are low on troops. They just made another call for, I think, another 30,000 reservists. A lot of Israeli soldiers are dying in Gaza. They're also dying in the north, and those numbers are not being published by the Israelis, who have a very tight grip on military information in their media. We at the Cradle get most of our Israel information from the Israeli media, from the Hebrew press. So, thank you for that. Their economy is just on a downward spiral since the Yemeni resistance, Ansar Allah, decided to start, in support of Gaza, targeting Israeli-bound and Israeli-linked vessels that were shipping goods to Israel. And that has expanded from the Red Sea into the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean and Gulf of Oman, and has had a huge impact. So, there are shipments still going to Israel. Israel depends, 80% of its imports come via sea. So it is a big impact, and there are shipments coming in, but the insurance premiums on these ships have gone so high, and just generally there's an inflationary trend globally. Prices have gone up everywhere. Ukraine certainly impacted that. So is the production, the constant printing of dollars by the US government, US Federal Reserve. Mm-hmm. But you also have now for Israel in particular, massive price hikes because just insurance and therefore shipments and imports have become exceedingly pricey for them to bring in to the country. So the economy is found. Then of course the Eilat port in the south has been disabled by the Yemenis and went bankrupt, declared bankruptcy. You have a couple of ports on the west coast of Israel on the Mediterranean, Ashdod, Haifa ports, which Hezbollah can very easily disable, but are a target for the Yemenis as well, now that they're operating in the Mediterranean theater. And so economically, there's a lot of hundreds of thousands of displaced Israelis from northern settlements and settlements near Gaza in the south of the country. They are possibly likely to be permanently displaced because and sort of like the largesse of the Israeli government has sort of diminished as their budgets have been strained to house these people as they were in hotels and other things. But all these people have also lost their jobs, their local jobs in these areas, if they haven't lost their homes already as well. And then you have a capital flight from Israel, which started actually before October 7th, when the judicial reform, civil conflict was taking place. Big Israeli businesses were a lot of them were transferring their money out into foreign banks, or not, repatriating funds that they had earned outside the country into Israeli accounts. You have increasing amount of Israelis leaving the country, and in poll numbers are, they poll quite high for Israelis who are considering leaving the country, some temporarily, a lot of them permanent. Because in Israel, in the Hebrew media, there is a robust debate about Israel's viability as a state now. And just, I think today or yesterday, I don't know how to say this word. I don't know why. I think I've only ever read it and not pronounced it. Ombudsman.
Yeah,
There
ombudsman.
you go. Yeah,
Mhm.
I only learned that one a couple of years ago too. So
Okay, no, I've read it plenty, but I've never had to say it.
Well,
So
there's actually a fun fact that says if somebody mispronounces words wrong frequently, it's probably because they read a lot. And I mispronounce words all the time, and all I do is read. So don't worry.
Yeah.
I said hegemony wrong until I was like 16 or 17.
Right. No, so the former ombudsman of the Israeli army, a reserve general called Yitzhak Brick, who has made some very bullshit, feisty statements since October 7th. He's very bluntly underlined Israel's dangers at various times since October 7th, in shocking statements. But he occupied a very, very important role in the Israeli military, and so he knows it well. He has said today or yesterday that Israel faces collapse in less than a year if the wars in Gaza and Lebanon continue at their current pace. So what happens if there's an escalation, right? I know a lot of people say, oh, Israel will never disappear because the Americans will always prop them up. Israel literally needs Jews to move to Israel and stay there in order to be a state. And if Israeli Jews leave the state, there is not a Jewish state, right? And so if the state starts and to hemorrhage the way it starts, it's already hemorrhaging in every sector. I mean, in the construction industry, for instance, who's building houses at a time like that? And that was a very high growth industry, right? And so the jobs like menial labor, et cetera, all of those have been, just disappeared. So anyways, Brick says that the defense minister, in this article we have on the Cradle today, that Israel's defense minister, Yoav Gallant, has begun to quote unquote sober up. And he says Gallant.
Has he been drunk this whole time?
Sorry?
Has he been drunk this whole time? That would make a lot of sense.
No, I mean, listen.
I know what you meant. I know what you meant.
I know. But honestly, it's something that really needs to be pointed out over and over again. People in government exist in bubbles. This is a big problem. The more senior you are, the less exposure you have to normal people. Yeah. Do you know? Yeah. And these are dangerous bubbles. These are dangerous bubbles for national policies. All right. So in that sense, I mean, for sure, Gallant is now raising eyebrows, rolling his eyes back, flipping off Netanyahu on his comments of we are ready to achieve a total victory in Gaza. I mean, even the Americans are saying, no, you're not going to have a total victory in Gaza. What could have been possible in the first month has become impossible, other than genocide and complete destruction of Gaza, in which case Israel will not exist as a state for a whole host of different reasons. But Brick says that Gallant has started to understand if a regional war breaks out due to Netanyahu's failure to reach a ceasefire, Israel will be in imminent danger. And that Gallant now understands that the war has lost its purpose, that Israel is sinking into mud. This is his language. We're losing fighters who are killed and wounded. And by the way, the number of Israeli troops who have been injured and disabled permanently and blinded and lost limbs is off the charts. And it was off the charts in December when Israeli Hebrew language investigations showed, thousands and thousands packing in hospitals near the north. So he says the country is galloping to depreciation. If the war of attrition against Hamas and Hezbollah continues, Israel will collapse in no more than a year. Okay, so it's a warning from more sober-minded people. Like I just met with someone who is exceptionally sober-minded, tends to share my perspectives on the region, but has never, ever said, sort of never helped fuel my excitement about possibilities. Is always like hardcore, it's not going to happen, said to me yesterday, there's going to be a war, So, yeah, I don't remember what the original question was.
It doesn't matter. This was great anyway.
That was great. It was a great summary of just the spiral that Israel's in. And not only Israel, but really this entire coterie of Western interests, really. And I'm glad that you mentioned, the capital flight from Israel, all of these different ways that the ongoing war has really crippled them economically, socially, in international diplomacy, in all of these ways. And it feels like, so it feels like with this kind of current environment that, and I wanted to turn a little bit to the propaganda war, that the narratives, the media narratives, that the West is trying to shape, that Israel and the United States and their associated companies and major monopolies are trying to shape, become more and more important in these kind of critical moments where they're trying to preserve this world order that was created, 70 some odd years ago, right? And I wanted to ask you about that because, Meta recently banned the Cradle from its social media platforms, meaning Facebook and Instagram, for allegedly violating community guidelines by, quote, praising terrorist organizations. And it cited different things that the Cradle has shared. I've always loved the Cradle. And when I, originally found the Cradle years ago, I was like, wow, this is amazing for a prominent news organization to have such, to be sharing such great information, to have such principles, and not only on issues related to West Asia, but also kind of more broadly geopolitically. So I'm curious to get your thoughts about why these major media outlets are targeting outlets like the Cradle, but not outlets like Al Jazeera, which obviously post similar footage. And would it be fair to say that it's the outlets who really voice support for a unified resistance, or add to this narrative of a multipolar world, are targeted well beyond those outlets that simply kind of virtue signal for the death and destruction?
Years ago, outlets like Al Jazeera were like a breath of fresh air to people like myself. I would watch Al Jazeera's English channel, and half the time I'd be furious, and half the time I'd be like giddy with joy. And I think that's the way media should be. It shouldn't just be one line. It should piss you off some of the time and like make you happy the other. It's outlets are places where you should have access to a variety of views. Now, the Cradle, we're really open to publishing on all topics. Okay, we're not covering certain topics. We have a worldview And our worldview doesn't come from like a traditional, we're in West Asia, or what others call the Middle East, and we're anti-imperialist and anti-Israel, which we are, but we're not like leftists, most of us, you know. So we don't really fall into any kind of category. And the other thing is, when the Cradle launched, it was about specifically West Asian geopolitics. We tend not to cover domestic issues in countries. You have to cross a border or two for us to pay attention to a news story, okay? So right from the onset, we weren't just looking at, you know, the resistance axis versus Israel and that kind of thing at all. Like our earlier coverage was about Eurasian geopolitics, because West Asia is west of the Asian continent. We are a geographical area that separates by land Asia from Europe, and therefore we are the bridge between Asia and Europe. And we don't exploit that geographic opportunity the way we should. And it's one reason why there's a lot of divide and rule projects that foreigners implement in this region. Imagine if you had a contiguous land route and communications and close relations and economic ties between Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Turkey, you know, right? The route to Europe, that would be a disaster for them. So we were, you know, very, I think, interested in the Chinese the Chinese BRI, you know, Belt and Road Initiative, which was the first massive development project, the kind of, you know, like global vision projects we'd seen in forever in this region, you know, since the Silk Road times and since colonialism, right? And this was an Asian state bankrolling by and large, and also creating the vision and the opportunity to bypass the typical shipping routes that the West controls and has controlled for hundreds of years, and create land routes which are cheaper and faster. So roadways, railroad tracks, pipelines for oil and gas, you know, things like that that would bring countries together. And the idea being that development creates infrastructure bills like this that have sense, strategic sense, create development, create jobs, opportunities, raise entire countries out of poverty, you know, and so this whole idea of China's whole recent thrust, you know, for peaceful development instead of chaos and war, was a very welcome thing, you know. And of course, I think regional states, particularly in the Persian Gulf and maybe some in North Africa, and the Levant, were hesitant about this. Oh, China, we've always been told China's the other, beware of China. But actually, China has come more and more to the region and shown its interest in actually forging ties and reducing conflict, as we saw with the Iran-Saudi deal last year. Out of nowhere, Beijing struck rapprochement between these two countries, you know, two countries where you had to pick sides on, you know, in this region. And then just recently, they got Palestinian factions together to strike an agreement that they would unify under the PLO banner so that resistance factions could play a role in what came after peace in Palestine, right? After ceasefire was struck. So, you know, these are the things that drove the Cradle. Like Turkey and Iraq now have announced a significant strategic coming together, where they were like, you know, lobbing spitballs at each other just a few months ago, because they've realized that if they don't come together, they want to create a route from the Persian Gulf through Turkey, through northern Iraq into Turkey and into Europe. And now the Americans and Israelis and Gulf countries want to create this International Middle East Corridor, IMEC, I think, that bypasses Turkey and Iraq and does it from the Gulf through Jordan, through Israel, Haifa, and then to Europe. And so a lot of alliances are shifting because of economy. You know, economy is the basis, the foundation of political power projection. So economy is everything, you know, and we've forgotten about that. We think missiles are power projections. Not. You have to have economy. And so these are the things that drove the cradle. And then we got, you know, like everybody else, October 7th happened, and we're now always resistance axis, Israel, you know, that's most of what we're covering, because that's what the news is. This is the biggest conflict in the world, or rather the conflict the world is looking at most closely on a day-to-day basis. So Meta comes in and suddenly decides that covering or posting a picture, which we don't do, by the way, we have not done typically. So posting a picture of a Hamas leader like Ismail Haniyeh or Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah, that this is supporting terrorism. Oh, I can't remember the exact language, but it's, you know, it's those kind of community guidelines, John, that you read out. And even an incitement to violence, because we would quote from them. Now, the Cradle does not put pictures of these individuals on, because we're a small media outlet, okay? And, you know, we'd rather not have to deal with losing access to these platforms. We've typically, if we have had visuals of these leaders, it's been like sort of blacked out or very faded out. You can't really see it clearly, as opposed to, you know, our colleagues at larger regional media outlets, like, as we pointed out in our article on the subject, Al Jazeera, not to pick on them, but to just serve as examples, Al Jazeera and Middle East Eye, were much larger, you know, seriously well-funded media organizations. And they put full pictures of Hassan Nasrallah, Ismail Haniyeh on their Instagram posts and their Facebook posts. We've never done that. Instagram took down a picture of Hassan Nasrallah's finger that we had posted. I mean, that's how bad it is. And then, of course, all of this escalated because we'd had a few warnings here and there, but nothing substantial at all. And we've been operating for 3 years on Instagram and Facebook. Suddenly in July, within the space of 48 hours, 10 posts were taken down, 5 on one day, 5 on the next. And they were like really dumb things to take down. I mean, they've taken down, for instance, quotes by Israeli officials that we've highlighted on Instagram. Okay, so there's nothing else there except a quote by an Israeli official, senior one, on Hezbollah and Hamas's capabilities and how they pose a danger. They also took down our backup account, which we didn't start after this. We just started a backup account just in case, when we started to see Instagram was acting a bit differently with us. And they took that down, and they took down our Facebook account, which, like, there's nothing, there's no violation. We don't have like any big history of, because we've just always understood that Facebook was, you know, the first place where censorship started being seen on the Palestine issue, et cetera. And now, you know, it's just a joke. Our funding has so, you know, a lot of people fund us during our podcast, our weekly podcast on Mondays on YouTube, and it quintupled this week, you know, and people in their comments wrote, I hadn't heard of the Cradle before, but, you know, this story drew me to you, because anyone who's being censored by these platforms, we know, have something to say. And that is by and large true. But here's my point. Like, if Meta actually thinks that we can cover, or anyone can cover, any journalistic enterprise can cover the biggest conflict now, you know, going on, that people are reporting on, without quoting from officials from one side, only having like Israeli quotes, right? Not quoting Hamas officials, Hezbollah officials, Ansarallah officials, etc. If they think anyone can report on the conflict with integrity without reporting from both sides, they're insane. And of course, anyone can see that. I mean, all outlets, including the Washington Post, New York Times, all of them will quote from these officials, but the Cradle is not allowed to. And what do we attribute this to? We're still small media. We now have, within 3 years of operating, we now have absolute global coverage. As I mentioned on our podcast on Monday, we even found we had one view from North Korea, and there's no internet in North Korea. We're like, that is so crazy.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so we have complete global coverage. Usually we have, because we write in English, we have North American and European and Australia, New Zealand as the main cities. So like the top main cities and countries that view us. But in the last 3 months, it was Singapore was number 1 or number 3, which is crazy. There's actually a lot of international relations, new thinking, new paradigm thinking happening in Singapore, which is a very small, like little island state, which excites me a lot because I happen to know about that. So the Cradle is being read everywhere. We from the onset focused a lot of our graphics efforts on creating maps that show new trade routes and new pipeline routes and new railroad tracks. And what this, when you see those, you understand why people are making decisions that they are, and those are showing up at university lectures. And if you Google the IMAC corridor, you will for sure find a Cradle map. So, we were starting to make a dent in narratives. Now, everybody covering this region as much as we do, we're getting huge readership boosts after October 7th, because everyone in the world wanted to know what's happening in the regions, much the same as what happened in 2011 when everyone in the world started reading, trying to find Arab bloggers who were writing in English. What are they saying? So of course we've had a huge bump from that, but in our internal comparisons that we do from time to time with other competitive media who are much bigger than us, we're on par with some of them. And people are coming to the Cradle through social media, but they're also increasingly coming to the Cradle directly. And why is this? Because while Al Jazeera and other big media in the region cover this region, they toe a certain line. You can't really go, you can't really cover the resistance axis, right? Like if you just do that, in some sort of distant way, the way Western publications do, you can get away with it. But the Cradle are, we're run by journalists, not donors or corporations. And so we're feisty and mischievous, and we like to naturally push our limits and hold power to account. Like that has to be the most fun thing a journalist can do.
Absolutely.
Terrible profession, so badly paid. For God's sakes, find something on a big official where there's something completely wrong. That's fantastic. That's what we should be doing. And of course, that doesn't happen anymore. So the Cradle still has some of that energy, and we like holding power to account. We like revealing things that aren't being revealed elsewhere. And so we've done it. So we haven't towed a line on the resistance axis. We just report on them in the same way we report on Israelis. Now, our worldview, of course, supports an indigenous West Asia, a West Asian view. Like the Arab people and the Iranian people and the Turkish people are much more supportive of this axis and its desire to, remove foreign bases or have foreign bases leave the region, have Israel stop its aggressions. That ain't an Arab view. That is an Iranian, population. Governments know. So these other media outlets toe their government lines, where we're not beholden to any government. And though we've been accused of being, but our model is we'll take money from the CIA, from the Saudis, from anyone, but they cannot own one share in the Cradle. And that's what gives us our freedom.
Well, yeah, that's amazing. I really like that you broke all of that down for us. I mean, it really does seem like the organic views are suppressed, and it's the synthetic kinds of manipulations that are promoted. And I just wanted to emphasize one point that you made. The fact that language, right? Language is such an important part of this propaganda war, and that they won't even the very fact that one, you have the economic worldview and basis that you shared, which I think is fantastic, and two, that you're even willing to share the words of Hamas leaders, of leaders of Hezbollah, because in the West we don't even get that. I mean, even just sharing the perspective, it comes. They're few and far between. Outlets like ours, DD Geopolitics does a great job of sharing what various world leaders are saying, even those who are adversarial to Western interests, so to speak. But it's like that people don't even know what Hassan Nasrallah is saying. But if people in the West were granted that exposure, they might have a very different idea of it, rather than just getting cherry-picked quotes through the New York Times that kind of decontextualize everything and kind of paint it in this context that's favorable to the West. And that's what I see with bigger outlets like Al Jazeera, and even those who cover Palestine from a more sympathetic angle. It's still within this kind of broader geopolitical context of this kind of assumption that the West is morally superior to these other emerging multipolar, whatever you want to call them, forces in the globe, right? So Al Jazeera will have, the coverage of Palestine, and then in the very next segment, they'll have, a piece that's critical of Russia, or they'll have a hit piece on a Chinese diplomat, right? So these are the kinds of patterns.
I would say what differentiates us also is that we're quite protective of West Asia and Asia, Eurasia. We see ourselves as part of an emerging Eurasian reality. Okay, so we're not, people say, oh, you're so anti-West. We're not anti-Europe. If Europe doesn't try to colonize us or send troops, we're not, because we're connected by land and we have to find ways to coexist and flourish together. I mean, just realistically. I also think that here's what's probably most dangerous about the Cradle for them. We publish in English, right? That's it. Oh my God, I'm about to run out of battery. Can I just get my charger? You guys talk, okay?
Everybody's
all right.
area is about to run out of battery too.
I think we're all about to run out of battery. So,
yeah.
This has been great, and I think it really just speaks to exactly what the Western powers and media institutions are afraid of, and I'm glad that we've been able to have this conversation, because the Cradle does. It's not even ideological, really, but just merely the fact that they present this information from a position that takes into account like organic economic realities of West Asia is very dangerous.
It's so funny that she was saying that that the Cradle uses mostly Israeli media. I find myself using a lot of Israeli media and a lot of American, like I read the New York Times every morning. So I mean, and I think Brian Berletich is actually the one who was like, well, like he was like, my sources are literally the Wall Street Journal, so nobody can say Russia didn't or whatever propaganda. And it's like, I'm using your sources. But yeah, all right, go ahead, John.
Sorry about that. That was just So if you're talking in English about these concepts, right? They're larger ideas. We're talking about peaceful development. We're talking about we're repeating the quotes of resistance axis officials. Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. Resistance axis officials who are repeatedly saying, we don't want war. We don't want a regional war. Just back down, stuff like that, showing, I find a lot of people who follow us, Americans, Europeans, fundamentally now understand, I mean, in the comments and the interactions we have, they fundamentally understand that these so-called terrorist organizations are the ones who are trying to de-escalate and avoid conflict. And they've also discovered that the resistance axis really, really tries to avoid civilian casualties, even on the enemy side. Things, little nuances that we've known forever. But certainly the Western narrative does not exist on this. We're just all terrorists, right? Now, the other thing is these organizations, Hezbollah, Hamas, Ansarullah, they're part of governance in these countries. There are Hezbollah MPs in the Lebanese government that gets funding from the US military funding from the U.S. government, you know, and it's kind of ironic. Like if somebody took them to court, that would be just such a lovely. I want people to file lawsuits because I just want to be there in discovery. I just want to like see how they make their arguments because they're so stupid.
You're just
you know,
nosy. You're like, I want all the juicy bits. Like I want all the good stuff.
No, I just want to know when they're not. They don't have you in a pen where they're, you know, the White House spokesman or the Pentagon spokesman is speaking, you know, you're journalists asking questions and you're cut off if you're, you know, saying something inappropriate or pursuing a question. Well, you didn't give me an answer. Let me ask you again. You know, reporters then back off. Do you notice this? Reporters then back off, right? Like if you're in a courtroom and you have to answer the question, I would pay to hear answers because there's no answer. And that's the thing. There's no answer. So they have to obfuscate through false narratives. Terrorists, don't allow them in the discourse. Okay. Right? Killers, don't allow them in the discourse. That's it. Because like living here, and I'm like a secular person who went to university in the States and grew up in England. And what do I have? What do I have in common with a lot of people in the resistance axis, okay, other than a worldview? I am treated, and this is something that astounded me when I first came here in 2009. I did an interview with basically the foreign relations chief of Hamas and the foreign relations chief of Hezbollah at the time for the Huffington Post, okay?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, which, by the way, very swiftly removed my entire archive of work on the Huffington Post once I started reporting from Syria on the ground.
Of course,
okay?
Yes. That's to be expected.
Right after AOL purchased them. So yeah, I forgot what I was going to say. Oh, when I met these people, I remember it was like Hamas and Hezbollah in their own words, right? The only way I sort of rejigged that interview was, you know, for clarity or for length and just question, answer. And people in the comments were like, well, they sound very reasonable. You know, it's like also my impression. And they didn't live in like, you know, elaborate, they have elaborate offices and, you know, marble floors and stuff. They had very shoddy quarters in very shoddy areas. These were not like, you know, people or officials living off the people, which is so typical of the grandiose mansions and palaces and whatever that you would see, you know, gold gilded, what was that expression? Whatever, gold toilets and whatnot. So that was interesting. The other interesting thing for me was, I mean, they took me very seriously. They didn't treat me like, you know, some dumb woman. They treated me as an equal. And I remember the time I had met, who I liked a lot. Frances Guy was the British ambassador to Beirut. What am I going to have in common with a British ambassador here? But we had some great talks because she was one of these ambassadors who wore like funky earrings, and she would like go into Lebanon. She would go to see things. She would meet with people everywhere from, you know, the sort of enemy type. She had a relationship with the the Shia spiritual leader, the Marja in Lebanon, Fadlallah, who passed away during her time here. But she also said to me the same thing. She said when she meets with these people, there's no sense of like, oh, you're a woman, nothing whatsoever. You know, they're very engaging. They talk to you like, what I'm saying is, I mean, I feel stupid saying this stuff because it's so obvious, but I understand the Western narrative is like, woman, go cover yourself and don't speak. It's not at all like that, you know? And she had the same experience. So as women, we sort of like, you know, connected on that. And and my interviews with the Hamas and Hezbollah foreign policy chiefs was you know, the beginning of years and years of me getting to know these organizations because they were so accessible, you know, and so not what I had ever read I mean, I've always known not to believe what you read in the papers, but if it's an area that you don't know well, we still believe what's happening in Myanmar. I'm like, oh, that's what's happening. Why am I listening to it when I know everything they write about this region is rubbish? So it's so important to get on the ground and meet these people yourself. It'll blow, people away. So for me, the Cradle was a great medium in which to do that, to let people know about what's going on the ground, not using the other's language to define ourselves, right? These people are part and parcel of our societies, these organizations, these movements. They reflect the aspirations of millions, tens of millions of people in this region. They're not like, they didn't just come out of nowhere. They're grassroots organizations that oftentimes introduced a military component only when they had to fight to protect themselves, and God forbid you characterize these demons in any other way. And we don't actually characterize them. Like, one of the things I constantly do, because people obviously in our newsroom, we have a lot of young writers who are obviously moved by these events and passionate about what's happening. And I always have to walk in there and say, listen, lose the adjectives, because I don't want to read a news story that says the extremist, whatever. Do you know everything? Like, everything has to be caveated, right? And you can't say Yemeni resistance. You have to say Iran-backed.
Iranian-backed
Exactly.
Houthis.
Yeah, Iran-backed Houthis, which it's so annoying. So we actually it's our news coverage, our news writing is very impartial, very objective. I would say the only differentiator that maybe shows our worldview is what we what we choose to cover. Do you know what I mean? And so we cover all the stuff that people aren't in the US, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and your point really resonated with me. It's like, you can know logically that the Western media lies. Like, we have this in our minds, like, we know this.
Yeah.
They're shaping a narrative consciously. But then when you actually listen, and I'm sure as you experience, get to interact with leaders of Hamas or Axis of Resistance leaders and actually speak to them, it's like, oh my God, like, what? Like, even with that knowledge, it's like, can they really be so disingenuous? Can the Western media really lie to that extent? Is that really possible? And then of course you see that it is, unfortunately, which is why we really need outlets like the Cradle. And so I just wanted to thank you so much for taking the time with us today and coming on the show. And would love to hear kind of what you're, as we're wrapping up here, what you're really most looking forward to coming forward.
I'm one of these people, don't take me wrong, but I almost wish the war would happen so we can stop the slow bloodletting. I've said this many times since 2013, when the Americans threatened to attack Syria. Like, instead of that attack that could have ended some things and set a new equation in the region, we have had the continuous bloodletting of Syria in every way imaginable. Syria is worse off today than it was during the hot war. So I would like to see either people strike a ceasefire, obviously, and walk down that escalation ladder, or let's just have this war and be done with it. If we're in a war of attrition, look, if we're in a war of attrition, Israel's going to lose. The Americans are going to lose, because we'll never leave. We're here. You can kill half of us, but we're still here. So and that's how resistance started. So attack us, and you're going to get worse. But a war of attrition can also, really exhaust people and their finances and stuff like that. So I would rather there be a quick, short war. But of course, most people in this region are not looking forward to that.
I think that becomes a sentiment amongst a lot of peoples in these sorts of scenarios. But Sharmine, Thank you so much, but we're going to have to do it again and again and again because we have to catch up from all of those months where I was chasing after you. So now we'll have to.
Now we have each other on email. Not a
We'll have to
problem.
talk again soon. Well, thank you so much, Charmine, and
No, it was my
thank you all for
pleasure.
tuning in to us. As you guys know, the discourse in America is getting pretty terrifying. So if you want to help us get out of the country, which we are moving within the next 4 months, please feel free to go to our website and donate, or Patreon or Substack or anything, and follow Charmine and go to the Cradle and visit the Telegram and find Pepe and do all of your chores and your homework. And thank you guys. And we will see you on Friday evening with Daniel McAdams.
Dude.